Breaking news. In a 6-3 decision, the United States Supreme Court just upended the criminal cases of hundreds of January 6th insurrectionists. Welcome back to Democracy Docket. I'm Mark Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started. The U.S. Supreme Court just released their decision in Fischer v. United States. Mark, tell us what happened.
Yeah, Paige, this is a really big case. We have been waiting every day for this case to be decided. It's one of the big ones of the term. And what was at stake here are a number of really hundreds of convictions of individuals who had been charged in connection with the January 6th insurrection under a statute that the government was using that is there to protect the integrity of official proceedings. And the Supreme Court narrowed the circumstances in which that statute can be used and really cast doubt on whether or not these charges and convictions can stand under this narrow construction.
But this decision could affect more than the people charged in the January 6th insurrection. Explain to us kind of the background of the case and how it relates to Donald Trump.
Yeah, so Paige, not only does this law potentially apply to contexts outside of January 6th, it was actually passed as a law after the Enron scandal, which people may remember was kind of a financial scandal, and as part of the Sarbanes-Oxley bill that was intended to broaden the kind of things that could be charged under enhanced penalties. So what the law did is, and it had several sections. In one section, it talks explicitly about obstruction through the destruction or otherwise the shenanigans involving documents and records and other physical objects. And then there's another section that just uses more broad language about obstructing an official proceeding. So the case before the Supreme Court was whether or not that broader provision about obstructing an official proceeding was also limited to kind of these financial cases or cases, even if not financial, that involved records and documents and tangible objects. And to be honest with you, I think a plain reading of the statute, the better reading of the statute, was what the Department of Justice said, which is that it does apply because the section that they were charged under did not specifically refer to documents or records. But unfortunately, a majority of the Supreme Court disagreed with me. They took a narrower interpretation. And because they did that, they excluded the kinds of obstruction that really was the bread and butter of January 6th, things like assaulting police officers, breaking down barricades, breaking windows, the kind of, terrible conduct that we saw on January 6th. And I think it's a real shame that the court took this interpretation, but that's what happens when you wind up with the Supreme Court that we have today.
So, as you said, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in this case. The January 6th insurrectionists argued that this law shouldn't apply to them. Lower courts split on whether the law applies or not. What was the actual substance of the decision? What was the court's reasoning?
Yeah, so the court's reasoning was that taken as a whole, the context in which the statute was passed and the other provisions surrounding this one, that essentially that it could only be read sensibly to include obstructions of official proceedings that involve the destruction of records, for example. So if there was an official court hearing and records were, and documents that were subpoenaed were destroyed, that would trigger this. If there was presumably a congressional hearing or a congressional process and records were destroyed or otherwise impeded, that it could apply there, but that it did not apply to these sort of non-documents or physical items kinds of circumstances. And I should point out that, by the way, this interpretation, the broader interpretation, the one that I think was correct, the one that the Supreme Court disagreed with me on, this had been the interpretation of both judges appointed by Donald Trump at the trial court level. It had been the interpretation of judges not appointed by Donald Trump at the trial court level. So this is a little bit of an outlier that the Supreme Court finds itself in now, where now it's the final say, so it gets to be now the decision. But this was not the most natural reading of the statute. And Paige, you can't help but wonder if this was not protesters in an insurrection, but this had been some kind of other protesters would some of these conservative justices really have ruled the way they did, which was to really cramp down the application of a broad criminal statute.
And it's interesting because the three dissents in this case were Justices Amy Coney Barrett, Elena Kagan, and Sonia Sotomayor. It wasn't a straight conservative liberal split. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson actually joined the conservative majority in narrowing the application of the law.
Yeah, look, and I think that Judge Jackson went out of her way to say, she's not casting doubt on the terribleness of the underlying conduct. She's not condoning or questioning whether or not there was, in fact, this effort to obstruct the counting of the certificates, but that she comes at this as many civil libertarians traditionally have, which is that we should narrowly construct criminal laws, right? That the tie goes to the citizen, not to the state, when you have this kind of ambiguity. So I understand where she comes at this from. I just think it's wrong, and I think it sends a terrible message in a case that involves Donald Trump and insurrectionists. Let's be clear. Donald Trump is charged under this statute. A large number of these insurrectionists were charged under this statute. Now, to be clear, a lot of these insurrectionists and Donald Trump, they're also charged under other statutes. So it's not like the cases against them are going to be thrown out. Donald Trump's criminal troubles continue, at least until we hear from the court on the immunity question. But, there's no question, Paige, that we're going to see the crazy conspiracies about a deep state and how this is vindication for the January 6th defendants. And I just think it's really unfortunate that this decision will give oxygen to the people who want to cast doubt more broadly on the outcome of the 2021 insurrection and the criminal cases thereafter. And look, this is why Democracy Docket has covered this so closely, because this case feeds not just a criminal case unto itself, but it feeds into the larger election denier narrative. But it is the reason, though, why, Paige, that this case has application or has impact outside of just the criminal law.
So the court basically ruled that to obstruct an official proceeding, you need to physically damage or destroy documents or records, right? You can't just kind of halt a proceeding like they did on January 6th by interrupting the official process and delaying it for a while. So what does this decision mean for all of the January 6th insurrectionists who were charged and convicted under this statute? What's next for them in their case? Some of them are in jail. Some of them are awaiting trial. What happens to them?
Yeah, so what it does is it changes the proof that you'd need in order to sustain a conviction. So I'm not going to go so far as to say all of them will be thrown out, because there were, in fact, physical documents in play on January 6th, right? The certificates that are signed by the governors, that are sent to the National Archivist and sent to Congress. Those were, in fact, in danger on January 6th, right? We heard harrowing stories about how they were sort of scurried out. And it may be that for some number of these January 6th defendants, or people who have been convicted, as you point out, that there may be evidence that, in fact, they were attempting to destroy those documents. But I think it means that for the vast majority of people who were charged on this statute, where it's really not about the certificates that were on the floor of the House or the Senate or the National Archivist records that may have been there, but that the predicate was just the obstruction of the proceeding by blocking hallways or by knocking down barricades or by assaulting police officers. I think those are in doubt. I think that where they're pending, those charges will be dismissed. And where they have been convictions, there will be post relief motions filed to try to throw out those convictions. Again, a lot of these people were charged under other parallel statutes that will not completely let them off, but the sentencing disparities may lower the sentences in some cases.
And what does the Department of Justice say about this case?
Yeah, look, so this is a breaking news case, right? So everyone's digesting this sort of as we go. Department of Justice put out a press release that, says, basically, don't worry, this won't affect the majority of the 1,400 defendants. And that's true as far as it goes. But again, I think we need to be clear-eyed. I try to be practical and clear-eyed when cases go the right way or are pro-democracy, and I also try to call it balls and strikes when they don't. I think that may be technically true what the Department of Justice said. I don't know that you're going to see a lot of people released from jail over this, and you're not going to see a lot of cases completely dismissed. But there is a rhetorical fight that is going on in this country. There is a political as well as a purely legal component to these cases. And there is no question that the Department of Justice lost today. There is no question that Donald Trump and the election deniers are going to claim victory, and they will twist in their way that they do every one of these criminal cases. They will twist into a narrative about how this was overreach in charging, and it just goes to show how unfair everything was. They're wrong, but we're going to hear that, and that will have impact in energizing the people who want to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat, and may embolden some number of people after the next election if we are again in a situation like we found ourselves in 2020, where Donald Trump doesn't win and people start to contemplate resorting to violence.
Does today's ruling affect Donald Trump's pending charges in any way?
Yeah, so some of the case, as I said earlier, some of the charges against Donald Trump were under this statute. But to be honest with you, they were not central. They were not the critical statutes in his indictment. So he'll claim vindication, but it won't have much of a practical impact for his indictment. For that, everyone needs to stay tuned for Monday, when we will get the long-awaited Trump immunity case. And that's really the main show. So make sure you are subscribed to Democracy Docket for their free daily and weekly newsletter. And I promise you, we'll be back as soon as we have a ruling in that Trump immunity case with the next episode of Democracy Docket.